So this is the third installment of the video lecture series that I am making for the seminar on Rudolf Steiner's The Philosophy of Freedom for the Bay Area Waldorf Teacher Training Program. And in this installment, I will be covering chapters 5 through 7, which are consecutively the act of knowing or the act of knowledge, human individuality, and are there limits to knowledge? So Steiner opens this chapter reiterating his criticism of critical idealism that he ends the former chapter with, claiming that because critical idealism ultimately depends on an assumption of the foundational reality of the sense organs, but reduces what those sense organs perceive to mental pictures rather than recognizing that also the sense organs themselves are mental pictures, critical idealism ultimately ends up refuting itself. So Steiner describes a kind of dialectical process from naive realism, which is the view that he thinks most human beings start out at least during our more materialistic era, where what you see is what you get. And there's a kind of suspicion of thinking as something not as real as what we perceive with our senses. To then moving on to critical idealism, which Steiner hasn't quite specifically defined yet, but we could say that critical in the sense that critical idealism moves beyond naive realism through the recognition that the world that we perceive is in some sense produced by our organization, that there are mental pictures that seem to mediate between us and something beyond those mental pictures. Not in the sense, for those who might be unfamiliar with this term as it's used in philosophy, of something positive, like a positive world outlook, but idealism in the sense of ideas or concepts, or the world is a mental picture. So that's what critical idealism means in this context. But with his emphasis on the necessity of thinking to weave the individual percepts into some kind of intelligible whole such that we recognize things, Steiner begins the chapter by reiterating, it is impossible to prove by investigating the content of our observation that our percepts are mental pictures. Because, as I quoted him saying in the former chapter, all of the processes that we might study through observation, through empirical science, whether it's brain processes, the processes of our senses converting physics into what we eventually experience in our soul, all of these are percepts, but it's only thinking that allows us to draw the connections between them and understand them. So Steiner implicitly is saying that it's only by means of thinking that we can actually insist that our percepts are mental pictures. But mental pictures of what is the question he will explore here and further on. He then compares critical idealism to modern science to the extent that both assume that there is some more real world beyond the world that we experience through consciousness. But like Goethe, Steiner wants to make human subjectivity an instrument, and so he's not satisfied with this. He then goes on to divide critical idealism into two variants, one of them being transcendental realism, which is essentially what I just described, the form of critical idealism that assumes that there is a more real world, a world of things in themselves that we are sort of in a dreaming relationship with. And if we could wake up into that world, we would be really experiencing the things in themselves. Versus what he calls illusionism, which assumes that there is actually nothing beyond what we experience as our mental pictures, and that even our experience of ourselves is a kind of illusion. It's all a dream. Steiner then takes up this comparison to the dream and says, now our dream images interest us as long as we dream and consequently do not detect their dream character. But as soon as we wake, we no longer look for the interconnections of our dream images among themselves, but rather for the physical, physiological, and psychological processes that underlie them. In the same way, a philosopher who holds the world to be his mental picture cannot be interested in the mutual relations of the details within this picture. If he allows the existence of a real ego at all, then his question will not be how one of his mental pictures is linked with another, but what takes place in the independently existing soul while a certain train of mental pictures passes through his consciousness. So what Steiner's saying in that first part is that when we're actually dreaming, we're immersed in the dream and just experiencing what comes to us. And it's only when we wake up that we then begin to try and interpret it, whether we interpret it as an expression of our physiology or some kind of psychological event from the day prior or a precognition. But we don't typically try to understand the dream within the dream. We're experiencing it. We're not trying to interpret the dream through dreaming, but only during our waking experience do we then try to understand it, because when we're dreaming, we typically, unless we're lucid dreamers, don't know that we're dreaming. As Steiner says of the transcendental realist, we might very easily be led to such a view by the observation that, in contrast to dreaming, there is indeed the waking state, in which we have the opportunity of seeing through our dreams and referring them to the real relations of things, but that there is no state of the self which is related similarly to our waking conscious life. Whoever takes this view fails to see that there is, in fact, something which is related to mere perceiving in the way that our waking experience is related to our dreaming. This something is thinking. So we could say that through thinking, we awaken to the conceptual relations or the meaningful relatedness between the things of the outer world that constitute a whole, but when we're merely observing, are sort of dreaming through, not really knowing how they're actually connected with each other until we reflect upon our experience or practice observing thinking, which then might eventually lead to a situation where there might be less of a gap between the time of observation and the intuition alighting within. Steiner then goes on to address the criticism that might come from someone who occupies a more naive realist position, which is where we all really start out, at least in our time. The materialist conditioning and the abstract thinking that corresponds with it, leading us to have a bias towards thinking as something that's less real than what we perceive with our senses. In response to this, Steiner writes, "You say the leaves and blossoms exist quite apart from a perceiving subject. But the concept appears only when a human being confronts the plant. Quite so. But leaves and blossoms also appear on the plant only if there is soil in which the seed can be planted, and light and air in which the leaves and blossoms can unfold. Just so, the concept of a plant arises when a thinking consciousness approaches the plant." So this harkens to the former chapter where Steiner described thinking as this sort of last link in the chain of creation, and that the human as thinker has this vocation of completing the world through knowing it. The human is that creature who brings the concept to the percept and makes a new whole, a wakeful whole of the world. To illustrate the necessity of thinking in order to wakefully know the whole, Steiner points out that a plant is not just what it is before you, but includes its whole life cycle. And it's only through thinking that we can weave together these separate phases of its growth. It's thinking which allows us to weave those separate observations or living thinking, imagination into one whole, and to then attune to the spirit or the idea that is bound up with what we're perceiving through our senses, and that unites that all into one being. It's the same with a human. And so we could liken the concept to a kind of spirit. I think this is where some of the translation nuances become important to highlight. So in Matthew Wilson's notes on the translation, he mentions that Geist in German means both spirit and mind, whereas mind in English and concept tend not to have the same association with spirit. But if we think about the different phases of a human being, for instance, rather than believing that we could know a person just based on having met them one time, limiting them only to that era of their whole life, through imagination or living thinking where we weave together a whole lifetime, we can really get to know that spirit. And that spirit combines the concept, the more general concept or archetype of the human with that individual human, because we only know things or ideas in particularized ways. So to draw again on the Kingdom of Childhood, the lecture cycle on Waldorf education that you recently read, Steiner's insistence that one educate with the whole lifetime of the student in mind is relevant here, to the extent that in order to do that, one would have to be capable of this kind of living thinking. Steiner then repeats something that's really important for his whole sort of outlook on the world and the human relationship with it. He says, It is not due to the objects that they are given to us at first without their corresponding concepts, but to our mental organization. So it's important to remember that concepts are always abstracted out of a living whole that each creature is bound up with, and that each creature is also itself a living whole. Both percept and concept fuse together, but in a dynamic way. It's because of the fact that as the unique creatures that we are, we can think that things appear at first divided off. And we'll get more into why that is soon. So again, it's we that introduce this gap. It's not characteristic of the world itself. The world is not actually a duality. The Steiner says, the separating off is a subjective act, which is due to the fact that we are not identical with the world process, but are a single being among other beings. It is not due to the objects that they are given to us at first without their corresponding concepts, but to our mental organization. Our whole being functions in such a way that from every real thing, the relevant elements come to us from two sides, from perceiving and from thinking. So here Steiner is saying that there's something about our mental organization or our constitution that severs things. Steiner says, it is owing to our limitations that a thing appears to us as single and separate, when in truth, it is not a separate thing at all. So if there is to be knowledge, it requires us to fit ourselves back into the whole. By means of what? Well, Steiner writes, the perception of myself does not take me beyond the sphere of what belongs to me. So there's this distinction between perceiving ourselves or self-awareness and thinking. This perceiving of myself must be distinguished from determining myself by means of thinking. Just as by means of thinking I fit any single external percept into the whole world context, so by means of thinking I integrate into the world process the percepts I have made of myself. My self-perception confines me within definite limits, but my thinking is not connected with these limits. In this sense, I am a two-sided being. I am enclosed within the sphere which I perceive as that of my personality, but I am also the bearer of an activity which, from a higher sphere, defines my limited existence, thinking. Our thinking is not individual like our sensing and feeling. It is universal. It receives an individual stamp in each separate human being only because it comes to be related to his individual feelings and sensations. He then goes on to give the example of a triangle. A triangle, though we might grow into our individual recognition of the concept of a triangle through different experiences. Maybe the first time you remember seeing a triangle, it was written on a whiteboard or a chalkboard or was in the shape of a block. Nonetheless, the concept triangle is common for all of us. It's the same, regardless of what word we use to designate the concept, because there are other words in different languages for it. So by drawing on the world of concepts, we can find, so by drawing on the world of concepts, we have this potential to find a kind of consensus or unity between human beings. We can bring our thinking into alignment with each other. And if concepts weren't universal, then even though translation is never perfect, it would be impossible. The fact that we can even intelligibly communicate with each other suggests that ideas do have some kind of transcendent or universal reality to them. So as Steiner writes, and I love this part, in thinking, we have that element given us which welds our separate individuality into one whole with the cosmos. Insofar as we sense and feel and also perceive, we are single beings, embodied uniquely, with unique formative experience. Insofar as we think, we are the all one being that pervades everything. This is the deeper meaning of our two-sided nature. We see coming into being in us a force complete and absolute in itself, a force that is universal, but we learn to know it not as it issues from the center of the world, but rather at a point in the periphery. Were we to know it at its source, we should understand the whole riddle of the universe the moment we became conscious. That would be a kind of like divine omniscience. But we're limited. We only participate finitely as particular individuals in the universality of thinking. The fact that our thinking reaches out beyond our separate existence and relates itself to the universal world existence gives rise to the fundamental desire for knowledge in us. So that the fact that we can think puts us in touch with this potential to know the whole, which has this kind of infinite living character to it and draws us. So our infinite desire to know the world is a reflection of that. Steiner then defines knowledge. He says, in thinking beings, the concept rises up when they confront the external thing. So as he said in prior chapters, observation kicks up thinking. Thinking reacts to observation. It is that part of the thing which we receive not from without, but from within. So thinking or the concept comes not physically from within, but spiritually from within. To match up or to unite the two elements, inner and outer, concept and percept, is the task of knowledge. So knowledge is this dynamic, participatory activity where we carefully attend to the world and thereby potentially receive the intuitions that help us to meaningfully understand the world and negotiate life. And so in criticism, again, of the naive realist position and the critical idealist position, which wants to explain things by means of other percepts, whether it's brain processes or some realer world out there beyond our mental pictures that gives rise to them, Steiner says it's only through thinking that we can make the relationship between things intelligible. This is a kind of, again, reading of the world that presupposes the reality of spirit, where spirit and mind have this kind of continuity. He says, all attempts to find a unity in the world other than this internally coherent ideal content or conceptual or spiritual content, which we gain by a thoughtful contemplation of our percepts, are bound to fail. Neither a humanly personal God, nor force or matter, nor the blind will, Schopenhauer, as we'll talk more about in a moment, can be valid for us as a universal world unity. All these entities belong only to limited spheres of our observation. Humanly limited personality we perceive only in ourselves, force and matter in external things. So it might be confusing to hear him say neither a humanly personal God nor force or matter, but what he means by humanly personal God is just that when we conceive of God or the divinity, surely in analogy with what we experience as our human personality, we're then attempting to construe the divine unity of the world in a way that is in the image of our percepts. But Steiner says, actually, and it's only implied here, that the true divinity would be much more akin to or bound up with active thinking, which is a kind of also creative activity. Steiner then goes on to address the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, who lived between 1788 and 1860, who was a famous philosopher, had a big influence on Nietzsche, and wasn't satisfied with thinking, as many aren't, thought it was less real than the embodied experience of the will. And so this is where Nietzsche's notion of the will to power comes from. So for Schopenhauer, what's really real is the will. So as Steiner writes of Schopenhauer, he believes that in the activities of the body, he feels an immediate reality, the thing in itself in the concrete, as the will. Against these arguments, it must be said that the activities of our body come to our consciousness only through the percepts of the self, and that, as such, they are in no way superior to other percepts. If we want to know their real nature, we can only do so by a thinking investigation, that is, by fitting them into the ideal system of our concepts and ideas. So Schopenhauer is arguing that the sought for meaning in the world is not arrived at through thinking, but that thinking depends on this more primordial reality of the embodied will. But Steiner says our perception of our embodied will has no more priority than any other perception that we have, and that moreover, the connection between the embodied will and all our other perceptions is something that we can only make meaningful through thinking. So, as Steiner concludes, neither the blind will to power can be pointed to as the unity underlying all perceptions. It is thinking that gives us that unity. As he writes, the separate facts appear in their true significance both in themselves and for the rest of the world only when thinking spins its threads from one entity to another. And even though I've already touched upon it, Steiner then brings his technical definition for the word intuition. So just to reiterate, philosophers often use in technical ways terms that we might use in everyday language, but they narrow it down. That's what I mean by technical. But Steiner, as he describes earlier in the book, is really aiming to use these terms as close to the everyday sense of them as possible. And I think his use of intuition comes close to that. So as he writes, in contrast to the content of the percept, which is given to us from without, but that includes our experience of feelings and past ideas and memories as well, the content of thinking appears inwardly, from this direction, you could say, though not physically. The form in which this first makes its appearance we will call intuition. Intuition is for thinking what observation is for the percept. intuition and observation are the sources of our knowledge. And then this great line, to explain a thing, to make it intelligible, means nothing else than to place it into the context from which it has been torn by the peculiar character of our organization, as already described. So here there's another reiterating that concepts are always abstract to the extent that they are pieces of a larger living whole. And to explain something is to place it back into a larger context and to understand it in relation to other things. And this is only necessary because we are at the same time beings that perceive the world through our senses, but also beings that can think. So there's this tension between the particularity of perception, embodied perception, and the capacity to think or participate in the cognition of universal ideas. And so then potentially unite the world again in wakeful knowledge. Then, if you've been sort of carefully following this, the question might arise, well, then what really is a percept if thinking is what determines the percept or makes it intelligible, puts it into connection with other things, and allows us to recognize it as some kind of discrete object? And Steiner writes, the question asked in this general way is absurd. What is a percept? A percept emerges always as something perfectly definite, as a concrete content. This content is directly given and is completely contained in what is given. The only question one can ask concerning the given content is what it is apart from perception, that is, what it is for thinking. The question concerning the what of a percept can, therefore, only refer to the conceptual intuition that corresponds to this percept. So what he's saying is that the question, what is a percept, can only actually be answered, as we've been reiterating over and over, by thinking. And so, as I mentioned in one of the prior videos, when the notion of the percept as a concept was introduced, this is something that Steiner feels is necessary as a philosopher in trying to break down the process of perception and cognition so that we can distinguish these different elements of what goes into it. So the objective world, the mental picture, and our subjective experience, thinking. But in reality, it's one living process, integral process. So surprisingly, the notion of a pure percept is something that is actually really an abstraction that we can only speak about because of the situation of our organization splitting the world in two. And then, but the notion of the percept is really important in Steiner's whole presentation of knowing the world because it allows us to think the objective world apart from our mental pictures. So as he writes, to form a link between something subjective and something objective is impossible for any process that is real in the naive sense, just limited to percepts. That is, one that can be perceived. It is possible only for thinking. Therefore, what appears for our perception to be external to the percept of myself as subject is for us objective. And this brings us back to the mental picture. And so by maintaining this sort of abstract notion of the percept prior to its conceptualization and becoming intelligible through that, he's able to keep in view the objective world, which we internalize in mental pictures that then modify our inner world, which he called in a former chapter, our self-percept, such that the mental picture, as he writes, is therefore a subjective percept in contrast with the objective percept, which occurs when the object is present in the field of vision. So we see a rose and we attend to it. That's the objective percept. It's stimulating this mental image, being filtered through our organism, through our perception. And then I remember that rose later on when I'm no longer standing before it. I have the subjective percept of the rose within me, and it's modified my inner world. And I know that there is an objective percept because I have taken with me an echo of it in the form of the memory image of the rose. Steiner says, confusing the subjective percept, that memory image of the rose, with the objective percept leads to the misconception contained in idealism that the world is just our mental picture. And this mental picture, as we'll find out, internalizing through experience the outer world is crucial for the act of knowledge and why it requires the participation of the individual. Why, for instance, one would make main lesson books rather than just receive information. And he concludes the chapter by suggesting that a deeper understanding of the mental picture which he'll be exploring in the subsequent chapters, will be necessary in order to understand how the process of knowledge is bound up with practical life. And then finally, in the addendum, Steiner goes back into that dialectic from naive realism, where we take the world as self-evident and don't really think that thinking itself has much to contribute, and then realize that our organism is constituting to some extent the experience of the world that we have in the mental pictures that we perceive of it, and that there is some kind of potential disconnect between our mental pictures and the world that we may need to correct. Steiner says that if we stay here within critical idealism, we're closing ourselves off to that fundamental desire, a craving for knowledge, which is a mark of our relationship with the life of the whole, with our still being part of nature, even though separated out from it. And he says the naive realist can be re-embraced if we recognize that, quote, as he writes, inside everything we can experience by means of perceiving, be it within ourselves or outside in the world, there is something which cannot suffer the fate of having a mental picture interpose itself between the process and the person observing it. This something is thinking. With regard to thinking, we can maintain the point of view of naive realism. So we can have a relationship with the real world. We can say that what we experience is the real world, as long as we are also including our thinking activity within that. And it can help us to correct our perceptions as we go. And this is really, you could say, this reaffirmation of a qualified naive realism that we can only embrace to the extent that we recognize thinking is always at work in perception, even though we can only really reflect on the concepts that are latent in perception later on, is a kind of nod to Goethe, who, in this famous exchange with the philosopher and poet Schiller, claimed that he was able to see ideas in his practice of attending to the plant world. And Steiner would say, yes, yes, Goethe could see ideas, but not just with his physical eyes, but also and indispensably with the eye of the mind. So, as Steiner alludes to at the end of chapter 5, the subsequent chapters will be dedicated to further clarifying the nature of the mental picture so as to further illuminate what the pursuit of knowledge consists in, how one practically unfolds it in personal experience. Steiner begins by saying, in explaining mental pictures, philosophers have found the chief difficulty in the fact that we ourselves are not the outer things, and yet our mental pictures must have a form corresponding to the things. And this is a problem for philosophers who subscribe to the critical idealist perspective, because if what we actually experience are only mental pictures of things in themselves, how is it, for instance, that we seem to be able to intersubjectively recognize similar things? Of course, there's differences in preference or interpretation sometimes, but for the most part, we tend to have a shared experience of the world. But Steiner wants to claim that this difficulty is really just illusory. He says, that section of the world which I perceive to be myself as subject is permeated by the stream of the universal cosmic process. To my perception, I am, in the first instance, confined within the limits bounded by my skin. But all that is contained within this skin belongs to the cosmos as a whole. Hence, for a relation to subsist between my organism and an object external to me, it is by no means necessary that something of the object should slip into me or make an impression on my mind like a signet ring on wax. The forces which are at work inside my body are the same as those which exist outside. Therefore, I really am the things. Not, however, I, insofar as I am a percept of myself as subject, but I, insofar as I am a part of the universal world process. And then he goes on, this universal world process produces equally the percept of the tree out there and the percept of my eye in here. So when Steiner here makes this distinction between I, insofar as I am a percept of myself as subject, versus the I, insofar as I am part of the universal world process, this is the distinction between the part of us that we experience through perception, our self-percept, and that percept of ourselves subsequently woven with the rest of the world once we've brought our thinking activity to bear on it. And so here again, he's reinvoking this perspective that he's introduced, which sees in the apparent duality of self and world something that our organization introduces rather than being something that is characteristic of the world itself. The fact that we are both beings that have embodied perception, limited in time and space, with particular organizations that render the world in qualitatively unique ways, but also beings who can think and so draw the connections between things and draw them back up into a unity. But then he takes up the pole of doubt and acknowledges that it's the physiological proofs that present the most difficult obstacles to embracing this view because of how certain materialistic interpretations of them have inclined us to unconsciously, or at least many of us, myself included, understand the relationship between our organism and the world itself. So backgrounding what I'm about to share is this notion that the world that we experience is less real than the world disclosed by quantum physics or what have you. So the example Steiner gives is the fact that an electric shock is perceived by the eye as light, by the ear as noise, by the nerves of the skin as impact, and by the nose as a phosphoric smell. Some would be led by these facts to conclude that what's really fundamental is the electric shock and not how our senses register it for our experience. But Steiner says, those who, from the fact that an electrical process calls forth light in the eye, conclude that what we sense as light is only a mechanical process of motion when outside our organism, forget that they are only passing from one percept to another, and not at all to something lying beyond percepts. So again, the metaphysical assumption behind this interpretation that Steiner's criticizing is that the world of physics, the electromagnetic forces, these are what's really real. But Steiner's saying, actually, what you're referring to as really real is just another field or another layer of the world of percepts that we may not be able to perceive directly with our senses, but only through our experience of the senses are able to indirectly observe. And then he draws an analogy to another fact of our perception, which is exploited by the movie industry or any film video medium, which plays a succession of images at a certain rate that produces the illusion of motion, and that this rate works with something that's distinct about our perceptual organization, which results in the illusion of motion. And so, in demonstrating this, we're not really saying anything of substance about the relationship between our mental picture, whether it's of light from the electric shock or the illusion of motion from the succession of images at a particular frame rate, but rather we are just gaining more insight into the character of our particular organization. In both cases, what we're exploring is how a given dimension of percepts relates to our organization. And so in each instance, we're just looking at different ways in which we are related to the whole cosmic process. But the only way in which we can clarify the relationship between a given mental picture with its object is through, as we've seen before, thinking. So it may be true that without eyes, the electric shock would not be registered by us by light, but that doesn't make the light that is registered by one who does have eyes any less real than the electric shock itself. As Steiner mentioned before, the full reality only comes with the combination of concept and percept together, such that the abstract notion of a percept on its own becomes illuminated, intelligible in a wider context. I can only understand what the color red is by reference to other colors. And so we have some repetition from the former chapter, but with more specification as to what the mental picture is. As Steiner writes, a mental picture is nothing but an intuition related to a particular percept. It is a concept that was once connected with a certain percept. So I saw the rose, and now the concept of a rose is associated with that experience, that particular experience of that rose for me. It is a concept that was once connected with a certain percept, and which retains the reference to this percept. My concept of a lion, for instance, is not formed out of my percepts of a lion because intuitions come from the other end, but my mental picture of a lion is very definitely formed according to a percept. So as individualized concepts, every individual will have unique mental pictures from experience referring to the concepts that are universal. Thus, as Steiner concludes, the mental picture is an individualized concept. And we can relate this again to the Waldorf method with the main lesson books, where students individualize concepts through personal experience, connecting concepts with definite percepts through art, through writing, through enacting the ideas in some kind of media. And Steiner says we can be sort of imbalanced in either direction. We can lack in the power of intuition and so not be able to really extract from our experiences the concepts that might help to recognize similar patterns in future situations, things we could avoid or things we might look for. Whereas someone who might have some kind of facility for intuiting concepts and connecting them, but not have good sense organs or may just have little experience in life, may be kind of sheltered, wouldn't really know how to practically implement those concepts or make them relevant to everyday experience. But Steiner says there's another factor for creatures such as ourselves in the act of knowledge, and that is feeling. Because we are beings who can think, and we also have embodied perception, we have self-consciousness, we have the participation in thinking, which helps to illuminate the nature of objects in the world of percepts. But we ourselves are also a percept, and that thinking relates those objects to our subjectivity, our personal self-consciousness. Steiner writes, we are not satisfied merely to refer the percept by means of thinking to the concept, but we relate them also to our particular subjectivity, our individual ego. The expression of this individual relationship is feeling, which manifests itself as pleasure or displeasure. Thinking and feeling correspond to the twofold nature of our being, to which reference has already been made. Thinking is the element through which we take part in the universal cosmic process. Feeling is that through which we can withdraw ourselves into the narrow confines of our own being. This might seem surprising for those of us who would think that something like empathy connects us with others. But as Steiner suggested in an earlier chapter, as thinking creatures, there's always this sort of mix of thoughts and feelings. And so, but as Steiner notes, feeling includes the polarity of pleasure and displeasure, or sympathy and antipathy, and is a kind of reflection of our being a limited being with a need to survive, a need to be self-concerned. But because we are also thinking beings that have this possibility of attaining to a relationship through thinking with the whole in a wakeful way, we can, through thinking, as Steiner suggested in one of the earlier chapters, produce mental pictures of the good in others and even entertain the notion of a feeling that reflects our awareness of our potential unity, wakeful unity with all things through thinking. As Steiner writes, one might be tempted to see in the life of feeling an element that is more richly saturated with reality than is the contemplation of the world through thinking. But the reply to this is that the life of feeling, after all, has this richer meaning only for my individual self. For the universe as a whole, my life of feeling can have value only if, as a percept of myself, the feeling enters into connection with a concept, and in this roundabout way links itself to the cosmos. What might this concept be? And again, Steiner waxes about this potential. A true individuality will be the one who reaches up with his or her feelings to the farthest possible extent in the region of the ideal. Perhaps something like cosmic love or desire, which reflects this understanding of ourselves as thinking beings who can potentially encompass the whole. This would require that we make a mental picture of that cosmic love by uniting the idea of it with our own feeling. Steiner acknowledges the sort of twofold aspect to the uniqueness, the individual character of our mental pictures. So there's the fact of our situatedness in time and space and how our personal experience in that context uniquely individualizes the concepts with reference to those particular percepts. But then he says also, each of us combines special feelings, and these in the most varying degrees of intensity, with his percepts. This is just the individual element in the personality of each one of us. It is what remains over when we have allowed fully for all the determining factors in our surroundings. One might connect this with the earlier mention of the characterological dimension of our organization, what is unique about each personality. But with Steiner's whole characterization of thinking and perception, this wouldn't be This wouldn't need to be conceived as something that's inwardly determining our behavior, but something that through active thinking, we artistically cultivate by attuning feeling to certain concepts of our choosing, such that through our feeling, there is this connection made between ideals and the living of life. As Steiner writes, feeling is the means whereby, in the first instance, concepts gain concrete life and relate us to the outer world, through which we bring our ideals into the world itself. And now for chapter 7, are there limits to knowledge? Steiner opens this chapter by rehashing his characterization of dualism and then putting that into connection with the monistic alternative, a qualified monism, in comparison to the materialist, spiritualistic, or that incoherent combination that he described, where the apparent duality that is introduced by our organization, where there seems to be a world of appearances and a world of things in themselves, is overcome through the act of knowledge, or the bringing together of percept and concept to the individualized concept, the mental picture, which forges a new unity between the human subject and the world. As Steiner writes, thinking then overcomes this particularity of the percepts by assigning to each percept its rightful place in the world as a whole. And so again, there's implicit in there the human desire to know, which is this expression of our belonging to the world, but our organization separating us out from it, being both a perceiver and a thinker, but through thinking and thinking's connection with feeling, forging that unity once again. And this would be an ongoing process, never completely finished. And so this is one reason why Steiner can claim that there are in principle no limits to knowledge. Impassable barriers to knowledge only exist, in Steiner's view, for critical idealists who follow Kant in claiming that we don't actually have access to the real world of things in themselves, but only to our mental pictures as conditioned by our organization. Steiner compares the critical idealist dualism to his monism by describing the former as issuing in a kind of doubling of the more simple relationship between percept and concept, with the object in itself, that thing that is as it is out there, and then the way in which it is constructed and appears in our consciousness, and then the concept that corresponds to it, which is all we really can claim to know. With this, says Steiner, the dualist therefore splits up the process of knowledge into two parts. The one part, namely the production of the perceptual object out of the thing in itself, he conceives of as taking place outside consciousness, whereas the other, the combination of the percept with the concept and the reference of the concept to the object, take place, according to him, within consciousness. As Steiner says, the objectively real process in the subject by means of which the percept comes about, and still more, the objective relations between things in themselves, remain for such a dualist inaccessible to direct knowledge. According to him, man can obtain only conceptual representations of the objectively real. So this is again the mistake of refusing to recognize that thinking is what determines the relationship between percepts, rather than assuming that there is something more real, but also like the percepts themselves that give rise to our percepts. Like the percepts themselves in the sense that they are considered to be something out there, rather than something that's put forth through us thinking. As Steiner writes, the ideal principles which thinking discovers seem too airy for the dualist, or insubstantial, and he seeks in addition real principles with which to support them. Real principles. So the dualist isn't that far off from the naive realist who doesn't really believe that thinking is anything substantial, but rather the only things that can exist are what can be perceived. And if anything else does exist, for instance, Steiner gives the example of the concept of a species, the naive realist is kind of forced to believe in something immaterial, in the sense that the tulip that one perceives with their senses somehow maintains its existence in what is referred to as heredity, even when it is not actually present. So the tulip passes away, but something persists in the fact that, as evidenced by the fact that more tulips will arise in the future. And so the naive realist is forced to embrace something like the idea of the tulip, but conceives it in the register of percepts or material bodies, but it's just displaced somehow, genes. This also applies to the conceptualizing of things like physical forces. Steiner concludes, the imperceptible forces which proceed from the perceptible things are in fact unjustified hypotheses from the standpoint of naive realism, for which that is most real, which can be perceived through the senses. He says this self-contradictory theory leads to what he calls metaphysical realism. And I just want to take a moment to comment on this phrase. I'm not sure what the German would have been, but by metaphysical realism, Steiner here means something specific, a certain view, which seems very similar to what he referred to as transcendental realism earlier, as he describes it, metaphysical realism, in addition to the perceptible reality, an imperceptible reality, which it conceives on the analogy of the perceptible one, which basically is him saying that in addition to the world that we perceive, there is a world beyond the world that we can perceive of forces that gives rise to this one. So that's what he means by metaphysical. It's beyond or below the physical realism. So being a realist about this other realm of forces that exists. And what's confusing about this is that for those familiar with philosophy, as I mentioned in a prior lecture, metaphysics refers to that branch of philosophy that deals with accounting for what's most fundamental about the nature of reality. So there can be many different metaphysics. Steiner himself, his monism, you could say, is a form of metaphysics. So that's why I just wanted to comment on this, because by metaphysical realism, Steiner means a particular metaphysics rather than a kind of dismissal of metaphysics in general. But Steiner is critical of this, as he said over and over, that the relationship between various levels of the perceptible world, whether they're indirectly perceivable, like electricity, or the various machinations of quantum physics, or what we can actually perceive with our senses. Those connections are only made explicable by thinking. It's not that one class of percepts gives rise to another class of percepts. They do have connections with each other, but those relationships can't be explained in terms of percepts. Because, for instance, the processes that we can study in my brain are just as much mental pictures as what I experience in my soul. As Steiner says, the purely ideal relationship is then arbitrarily made into something similar to a perceptible one. That's the mistake that he is constantly trying to bring our attention to. He says, if we are to avoid the contradiction of imperceptible percepts, we must admit that the relationships which thinking establishes between the percepts can have no other mode of existence for us than of concepts. Then he describes the monism that he's offering as a combination of one-sided realism with idealism into a higher unity, in the sense that it recognizes that our organization presents the world to us in mental pictures, but that thinking can clarify the relationship between those mental pictures and bring us back into a relationship with the world. By clarifying the relationship between our self-percept and the world of percepts without. He then says something really interesting. He says monism replaces those imperceptible forces that belong to the fields of physics and what have you, but are theorized according to the perceptible world. These are replaced by ideal connections which are gained through thinking. He says the laws of nature are just such connections. A law of nature is in fact nothing but the conceptual expression of the connection between certain percepts. So we could say that the laws of nature reflect certain habits of thinking or patterns of thinking in the mind of the cosmos. We're then brought back to the question of the limits of knowledge. As Steiner writes, the question concerning the limits of knowledge exists only for naive and metaphysical realism, both of which see in the contents of the soul only an ideal representation of the real world. So for naive realists, ideas are just imitations of what is really real out there in sense perception, but they forget the fact or overlook the fact that it's only through thinking that we're able to recognize the connections between what we perceive in the things that we perceive in the outer world. Whereas the critical idealist or metaphysical realist thinks that the mental pictures that we have within ourselves are images of another real world that isn't disclosed in sense perception and that we only have indirect access to. So for both, there are limits to knowledge. As Steiner writes, for these theories, what exists outside the subject is something absolute, founded in itself, and what is contained within the subject is a picture of this absolute, but quite external to it. The completeness of knowledge depends on the greater or lesser resemblance between the picture and the absolute object. A being with fewer senses than man will perceive less of the world. One with more senses will perceive more. The former will accordingly have a less complete knowledge than the latter. But for Steiner, because thinking is essential for knowing the world, articulating the differences between things and placing them in context, it's not so much that having more senses would mean that one knows more or knows more correctly, but rather how each organism is constituted with their various sense organs merely just gives a unique window onto the world that still nonetheless requires thinking to draw those percepts into a kind of intelligible relationship with each other. For monism, he says, the situation is different. The manner in which the world continuum appears to be rent asunder into subject and object depends on the organization of the perceiving being. The object is not absolute, but merely relative with reference to this particular subject. Bridging over the antithesis, therefore, can again take place only in the quite specific way that is characteristic of the particular human subject or thinking creature, if there were other creatures who could think as we can. As soon as the I, which is separated from the world in the act of perceiving, fits itself back into the world continuum through thoughtful contemplation, all further questioning ceases, having been but a consequence of the separation. So very interesting here that for Steiner, questions are this means by which we forge a unity back with the world, and that act of forging is itself what knowledge means. And now, even though he mentions this earlier in the chapter, his claim that there are no real limits to knowledge makes more sense. What might otherwise seem like a quite arrogant claim actually ends up appearing more realistic and practical and a more sober understanding of what knowledge means, closer to life itself. It follows from the concept of the act of knowing as we have defined it that one cannot speak of limits to knowledge. Knowing is not a concern of the world in general, but an affair which man must settle for himself. In our knowledge, we are connected with questions which arise for us through the fact that a sphere of percepts conditioned by place, time, and our subjective organization, is confronted by a sphere of concepts pointing to the totality of the universe. My task consists in reconciling these two spheres, with both of which I am well acquainted. Here one cannot speak of a limit to knowledge. It may be that, at any particular moment, this or that remains unexplained because, through our place in life, we are prevented from perceiving the things involved. What is not found today, however, may be found tomorrow. The limits due to these causes are only transitory and can be overcome by the progress of perception and thinking. So this confidence reflects Steiner's conviction that we are really part of the world and that knowledge is not this complicated process of inwardly mirroring the world or reproducing something that's really real about the world in our souls, taking in information, but that it consists in this dynamic process of attending to the world as it discloses itself in our perception for our observation, and then reflecting on the relationship between ourselves as the observer, questioner, and the things. So always come down to what is it that we're seeking to know and how can we constantly vary our position and look at it from as many different angles as possible. And so it seems implicit that for Steiner, the act of knowledge is not just an individual enterprise, but collective one as well. One that our whole species, the evolution of our whole species and its history, and all of our cultural activities are bound up with. As he says in an earlier chapter, remembering that knowledge is this pursuit to bridge over the apparent duality introduced by our organization. This feeling makes us strive of desire to bridge over this antithesis, and in this bridging lies ultimately the whole spiritual striving of mankind. The history of our spiritual life is a continuing search for the unity between ourselves and the world. Religion, art, and science follow, one and all, this aim. So really, in art as well, all of these disciplines sort of converge again when we conceive of knowledge this way. Knowledge then isn't just about having this abstract armchair collection of information about the world, but having a kind of wisdom, a living wisdom that binds us to the world in a new wakeful unity, and perhaps informs how we now may consciously direct the future of human evolution. And then in the addendum of this chapter, Steiner takes up again the pole of doubt and just addresses that metaphysical dualist tendency to construe knowledge as this endeavor of trying to get to know what's really real through the indirect disclosure of it in our mental pictures, that this world of quantum physics is more real than the manifest world that we perceive with our senses. And Steiner acknowledges that man's being, quite concretely, is determined not only by what his organization presents to him as an immediate percept, so what I see, plant, through my senses, but also by the fact that from this immediate perception, other things are excluded, like ultraviolet light or other things, perhaps even beings. Just as it is necessary for life that in addition to the conscious waking state, there should be an unconscious sleeping state, so for man's experience of himself, it is necessary that in addition to the sphere of his sense perception, there should be another sphere, in fact, a larger one, of elements not perceptible to the senses, but belonging to the same field from which the sense percepts come. So what he's saying is that even these indirectly perceptible percepts that we don't have directly through the senses, they're still part of the world of percepts. So he's acknowledging this large sphere of percepts that we can only come to indirectly. But once we become aware of them, for instance, the notion of gravity, that things fall to the earth, this actually, even though we can't see it with our eyes, it enters into the realm of observation or perception to the extent that we've made it intelligible through concepts. And this is something that we have as a gift through the striving of humanity as a whole, the pursuit of science. I didn't discover gravity. Someone else did. But thanks to their discovery, we can all recognize it. And then Steiner says something that I think is really important for anyone who's interested in seeing the connection between the philosophy of freedom and Steiner's later anthroposophical, more esoteric, clairvoyant dispensation. He says, "It is to be remembered, too, that the idea of percept developed in this book is not to be confused with the idea of external sense percept, which is but a special instance of it." So remember, even ideas, once they've already been thought and are now a kind of mental image for us, those also are included by Steiner within this concept of percept. Percept is anything that we can observe. And so we can actually potentially, maybe through Steiner's anthroposophical training, meditations, expand the range of what we can perceive, perhaps even to perceive not with our senses, but with our souls, spiritual realities. The reader will gather from what has gone before, but even more from what will follow, that percept is here taken to be everything that approaches man through the senses or through the spirit before it has been grasped by the actively elaborated concept. So what he means is that before it has been grasped by the actively elaborated concept means it's something that we might have an observation or an experience of before we've understood it, before we've been able to bring the corresponding concept to it and make sense of it. Like, what does this mean? It's kind of like, when you have a dream and you're like, what did that mean? Like you've met the percept of the dream, but you don't know how to understand it yet. You don't have the corresponding concepts that would make it intelligible for you yet. The same is true of potential spiritual experiences outside of the dream realm. Senses, as we ordinarily understand the term, are not necessary in order to have percepts in soul or spirit experience. It might be said that this extension of our ordinary usage is not permissible of the word percept, but such extension is absolutely necessary, he claims, if we are not to be prevented by the current sense of a word from enlarging our knowledge in certain fields. So his innovation in the notion of percept, which philosophers have been doing throughout history, altering the way we think about certain concepts by using it in an expanded way, might enable us to include within the range of possibility for what we can observe much more than what is delivered by the senses. And that's it for now. First half of the book covered. Thanks so much for your attention. Looking forward to being in dialogue, and there will be more towards the end of April.